Good evening, everyone. My name is Ken Goldberg. I'm the director of the series, The Art, Technology, and Culture, and I'm delighted to host you here this evening, along with our staff and our sponsors, the Berkeley Center for New Media, Citrus, the Parr Lab, the Office of the Chancellor, and individuals such as Steve Beck, Tayar Moore, and Will Wright. Please take a moment to visit atc.berkeley.edu to join our mailing list and find out about future events. So for the second time this week, an enormous crowd has assembled to attend an event featuring a remarkable couple from Great Britain. It's been over a decade since Christopher Alexander has given a major public lecture in the United States. And we're extremely honored that he's chosen the Art, Technology, and Culture Colloquium for this presentation. His talented wife, Maggie Alexander, will present a special architectural tour of the Rose Garden tomorrow at 1 p.m. They got married in 2003, and none of us were invited to that wedding either. UC Berkeley initiated this lecture series 14 years ago in response to emerging ideas at the intersection of art, technology, and culture. Inspired in part by C.P. Snow's 1959 essay, The Two Cultures, and the challenges of building bridges between them. Since then, we've hosted 139 speakers. And tonight, we will hear from a profound, paradigmatic, and iconoclastic thinker who has done perhaps more than anyone else to lay out a blueprint for just such a bridge. Christopher Alexander's ideas about the synthesis of art and science have influenced architects and technologists, such as Don Knuth, Bill Joy, Will Wright, Brewster Kahle, and Chris Cox of Facebook. It's my honor now to turn the microphone over to my friend and colleague, Associate Director of the series, Greg Niemeyer, who will give our speaker tonight a royal introduction. Great.
Let's go. Good evening. It's a great honor to introduce Christopher Alexander. Christopher Alexander achieved something that we all would like to achieve. He started a fire that kept burning like a perpetuum mobile. It just went going on and on and on. At the age of 28, he wrote Notes on the Synthesis of Form, and in Notes on the Synthesis of Form, he says, there is a context and there is a function. The form is in between. Both the context and the function are, there's a context and a function, and the context and the function are both unknown. And the form, the trick is to find a form that matches both, although both of them are unknown. Now, applying this inspiring remark to the current situation, one would say, what is the context here? The context is you, all of us together, and the form is the introduction. So how does one do an introduction? What is the pattern for an introduction? Well, the pattern is to bring you to the main event, which is similar to a guide, a tour guide in a city. A tour guide in a city would have a map like this maybe, and would say, well, we're not yet at the main event. But there are several approaches to it, and I would like to be inspired by Christopher Alexander to show you what these approaches might be. First of all, Professor Alexander is a family father and has children and grandchildren here, and that is something that needs to be acknowledged, first off. Second, an important path towards his work would be through Pattern Language, a website where you can learn about the current work, past work. It's a beautiful website you can spend hours and hours of time with. Another path would be Berkeley, 1963 to 2001, because Professor Alexander taught here for 38 years and inspired generations of architects initially. And his influence is much broader than architecture, so we would like to think of a path of access to Alexander's work as simply the fact that he managed to connect art, math, architecture, computer science, but not in a theoretical way, in a way that makes us understand life better. For example, he wrote about chairs that it makes no sense for all chairs to be the same. because we all are different where we sit. So we should all have dining room chairs that are slightly different to accommodate our various sizes and tastes. And it doesn't make sense to have the same chair everywhere. Unfortunately, here we are all seated on similar chairs, so I hope you can put up with it. Maybe by the end of the evening, we'll rip out the chairs and replace them with something else. Literature, you can access his work through literature, of course, and there's Notes on the Synthesis of Form, which we mentioned, written in 1964 at a time when Professor Alexander was at the tender age of 28. And from there came the book of Pattern Language, and from there came the book of Timeless Way of Building, and finally many more, but finally currently the publication is Nature of Order, which is very compelling and reaches from architecture into math, science, and religion. What I'd like to say about pattern language was that oftentimes people look at the patterns today and say, oh, I'm going to use pattern 23 to figure out my architectural problem. I'm going to use pattern 56 to solve my computer science problem. I'm going to use pattern 21 to invent something like Facebook, or a Spore, or things like that. And so it's been very influential, but looking at the pattern is much like looking at the finger of the wise man as he's pointing to the moon. The pattern was not the message. The message was to find patterns and to look for patterns and to think about patterns and to see how patterns gradually emerge from the organic life that unfolds between form and intention and context and function. If you don't like those many approaches that I already laid out and they don't work for you, there's actually the buildings you can look at as well. Professor Alexander has created 200 or more buildings, some of them in Tokyo, some of them right here in Berkeley, some family houses, some in Albany, some in Oregon campus, Aishin campus in Tokyo as well. And if you can't travel that far, there's words that travel for free and that travel open boundaries in your own mind, so you don't have to go anywhere to discover new territory. Those words are pattern. Ask for the pattern. Object-oriented programming. Ask for how methods exist independently of the space that they are created for. And finally, the concept of versioning. How many versions of things have you seen in the past? You've seen versions of software. You've seen versions of cars, products, things that you buy. And really, one of the messages that we can extract from Professor Alexander's work is the notion that things always will change. And we just have to admit that they change and embrace the change and embrace the concept that tomorrow things will be different. And then we're on the path to understanding the patterns of life. Of course, if all these things don't work, there's another path of access, and that is the one of the awards. So there's many awards that Professor Alexander has collected throughout the years. One of them is the Academy of Art Sciences. He's a fellow since 1996, an elected fellow. And then we have a gold medal for research from the American Institute of Architects from 1970 that I'd like to mention as well. So continuing briefly with my metaphor here, in Siena there is a wonderful plaza. This is one path of access to it that shows you that the valleys are very narrow, much like my introduction is very narrow. And the valleys of streets here are very narrow, and they lead to a bright place called the Piazza del Campo. But you don't know about it yet. You just get a hint of it. It's glowing there in the background, right? And here's another path. This one's a little more convoluted. You have to negotiate all sorts of vendors and social dynamics to get to the piazza, but you might get there eventually. Here's another path that now gives you a hint of what's about to happen, the Torre del Mangia. And it towers over this space and inspires people to be civic-minded, to think civically, and to see the larger to see that there's larger context besides their own individual context. And that brings us back to this exact pattern, which is nothing but a drawing of that same piazza. Please welcome Professor Christopher Alexander.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Very nice of you to introduce me like that. I've got to collect my quotes. This is a very... Sorry? Oh, right. Oh, you want my... going to pick my pocket?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I put it in the same pocket? Okay. Fine. Thanks for remembering. It's hard to explain why this is a complex situation, difficult for me. I know I'm going to have a hard time speaking to you tonight, not for any emotional reasons, just because the topic is so confusing and so complicated. That I don't have it in order in my mind at all. And that's not all that novel for me. I've talked a lot of bullshit in my time, and I don't think I ever gave a lecture at Berkeley that was prepared in advance in 40 years. So that's not new, but usually some of those lectures came out fairly coherent. Any problem?
No problem.
A secret problem. Okay.
Just getting in sync.
Okay. The discipline that we've come to know as architecture has gone off the rails with immense momentum, and pretty much about 100 years, maybe a little bit less than that, 80, 90 years. And let me start rather concretely with one aspect of architecture. As a matter of fact, are you able to, Lily, are you able to forget the main slideshow, but can you just put up the pictures of mass production? Okay, this is, oh, hang on, that was fine, yeah. This is one of the hangars in Seattle, and these are B-17s that were being produced in about 1940. It wasn't the first time that there'd been mass production, but it's a fairly dramatic picture, I think. And, oh, hang on. Sorry, I didn't tell you how to do this. Can you just hold the B-17s for a sec? That's okay. What's going on? Don't know how to do it. Can we just take them one at a time?
How do you right click? Okay.
Do you want to just show them?
Actually, the main thing I want to show right now is that. Yeah. Okay, that is an erector set for kids that was made, I can't remember the exact date, but maybe around 1915. The B-17s were being produced in 1940 approximately. And since then, the attempt to build buildings has been entirely swamped by the use of mass-produced components. Now, I'm sure that many people would imagine that that is a great blessing, which is not only going to give untold wealth to people who make these things, but it's going to be clean, efficient, cheap, etc., etc. All of that is somewhat overblown. But nevertheless, that is what has taken over really the whole field of architecture. And the way in which architecture is transmitted is through drawings. So the architect does not actually know how to make anything. He draws, or she draws drawings and has some organization produce buildings from the drawings. And again, that doesn't sound, I mean, we're so deeply into this way of thinking that it doesn't sound like a dreadful sin or anything, or like a huge blunder. It just sounds like a very practical thing to do. Now, I think I need to just sit down for a moment, just while can I get that light out of the, oh, that's not too bad. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, I'm a bit wobbly. The organization of nature, starting with that, is essentially not modular in the sense that architecture has been made modular. Of course, someone will immediately jump up and say, well, what about molecules? What about atoms and so forth? Which, by the way, are many of them largely different. They are unique structures from a quantum level. But what's more to the point is that the reality of things, what I call the reality, and I'm going to dwell on that word for a while, comes from the structure of something which at every level is highly complex and unique. And there are no, the idea that things can be made by assembly is really a completely crackpot idea, which does not work. And it's simply an idea which has swelled and expanded so that from the child's constructor set or erector set, one gets a whole vision of the world and how things in the world are to be made and are made. And of course they are made that way now. Now, from a structural point of view, you can either have this assembly or arrangement of prefabricated parts, which to many architects is a gift from heaven in some weird and meaningless intellectual fashion. Lily, can you grab a hold of the picture of the 6 hawthorn blossoms opening?
The blossom?
Yep, thank you. So this is just a spray of flowers, and you'll see them start from buds. And okay, so these are the buds. I'm just showing 6 slides just to give an idea. So, is that the last one? Okay. Now, I'm sorry, I'm so parched. It's preventing me from thinking properly. In a situation like that, at each moment, the whole is being transformed by many, many processes that are going on roughly at the same time. And because of the way that continuous unfolding is taking place, you have the beauty of the hawthorn bush coming about as a result of the unfolding process, where everything develops together and where its detailed organization is created by transformations that occur in the wholeness of the branch or plant or whatever. Architecture used to be like that up until, well, hard to, it depends when and where, but anyway, up till a couple of hundred years ago, that was also roughly what happened with buildings. And the complexity that a building needs and can be enjoyed and loved by the people who live there or the people who look at this and that window or building or railing or whatever, all of that has been cut short, as we are utterly aware. You go out on the street and you see nothing but crap. Large-scale crap and small-scale crap. But it's all of the same nature, which is it's essentially been pieced together by very simple-minded methods, very sophisticated technically sometimes, but the ability of a building to work as a whole and as something that is nourishing to the human beings who live there or work there or use it, all of that has been damaged colossally. And I'm sure you think I'm a crackpot already, just from my few minutes so far. I'm not a crackpot. I can assure you of that. But the point is that no one has had the courage or the common sense to recognize this difficulty and say, hey, we've got to stop this and we've got to do something about it. Amazingly, that has not happened yet. There are a few visionaries or seers who do understand this, but who can't really find a way in contemporary society of earning a living even in trying to make buildings in that way, because the whole vehicle of production does not have the capacity to deal with this kind of context-dependent creation of parts and holes and parts and holes nested within other holes and so forth. That has really gone with the wind. And it's not only become the case that this vast majority of metropolitan areas are blackened by this disease. There is no particular surprise that mental health is plummeting, and the capacity to love, and I'm not talking about one person to another necessarily. One can love a dandelion or a mouse or the front steps of the remnant of a building that might have been built a couple of hundred years ago, when stairs and steps were built by hand, and the pieces of the stair, the treads, the rises, the lip, the overhang, all of these things were shaped in such a way that each piece it precisely fit into the context that was being created with this evolving larger structure. I'm a person who builds. There's quite a few people in this room that I have trained who are also doing their best to work in this way. But the question of the large-scale production of society has not really been tackled at all. So we are prisoners of this horrific situation, a calamitous situation, and the love that a human being carries in his or her heart in relationship to the world where they live, all of that is essentially broken down. Of course, there are remnants which people may be fortunate enough to experience, but it is not the norm of the way architecture is done. You may say, well, architecture, not so important perhaps. I believe that is very, very far from the truth. The environment that we live in plays a colossal role in our lives, spiritual lives, everyday lives, fun and games lives. And what can happen to people living in this period of history is devastating. Devastating. Now, the main subject of this lecture is a project that we undertook in Japan starting in the early 1980s to build a campus outside Tokyo. And I'm going to show you a lot of pictures and discuss some of the things that happened and that were necessary to achieve what we did achieve. But I am saying that unless one turns the methods and processes and production methods around, there is no way that human life on Earth can maintain itself or be a success. It's a colossal problem, utterly unacknowledged, except by a few people who rant and rave. Another drink of water. So, I mean, just to be as clear as possible, the methods by which the human environment are built have been damaged to extreme and extraordinary limits. I first began my serious work on this issue in 1958. And so I've been working on it from 1958 to 2011. So that's some 50 odd and then some years. I've achieved a tiny bit of the steps needed to begin to change the horrific situation that I've described and to make it possible for people not only to love the places where they live, but even to love one another. These matters are all connected. And if you live in a system of boxes, as most people do, you can barely struggle to achieve an effective life. I'll tell you a funny story about St. Francis. St. Francis was, of course, you know who St. Francis was. He was a monk in Assisi. Lived, I can't remember the years, probably 1215 or 1220 or something like that. And this is just one particular story, one tiny story. I mean, you know stories about him and his love for animals and birds and so on. But there's a rather funny, vivid image which may be not known to you. He built a little tiny chapel called, I think I've got it wrong, but anyway, something like the Portaiuncula, just outside Assisi. The church is, the length of the church is about the width of this room right here. It's a very tiny building. It's a marvelous place, and it was made by Francis and his brethren for over a period of not so many years, but a number of years. Now the funny part of this is that in around end of the 16th century, people thought St. Francis, as he was by then, was so important that they thought they would do for him the ultimate honor of building another church, a very, very large Baroque church, in which this little tiny chapel was literally encased. I mean, it was a tiny building, that big, compared with this Baroque church that was massive, ugly as hell, rarely visited, and it was a foretelling of the forms of production which now exist in our society. I mean, not everything that is old is beautiful. And this was a completely crackpot and unsuitable, inappropriate way to deal with St. Francis's lovingly created portajuncula. I know this is an odd story just to throw in, but is it for laughs? No. It's a serious story. So the question is, can we at all hope to create a world in which things are made with judgment, with love, with adaptation, with continuous modification, with everything that transpires in the system that I have come to call System A. And System B is the production world of the B-17s and of the production of computers, prefabricated houses, supermarkets, factories, and so forth, all of which, of course, we benefit from on some material level. But it does take away our birthright and heritage. And it makes it almost impossible to be a full human being. I'm sure you think I'm exaggerating. I don't think so myself. I don't think so. So now, what I want to do is stop talking for a little while. I'm going to show you some pictures which are just going to run without my comments. And you'll see this place which my colleagues and I have built. It's still not finished. one of my colleagues is Professor Hayo Nice, who's sitting in the back and is now teaching at the University of Oregon. Another one of the people involved in this is my wife, sitting over there, and who has learnt a lot about architecture in a very short time, but has the instinct to know how one goes to that place, which I call A, rather than to the place that comes from system B. So anyway, what I'm going to do is I'll just shut my trap and let you look at the pictures. Since I want to show you quite a lot, they're being put on the screen fairly fast, I'm afraid, but otherwise it would make it impossible to give this lecture. And then I will, after you've had a look at these pictures, I will talk some more about the conditions under which these sort of things can be done. So I think I will remove myself for the moment. You haven't got rid of me yet. So you're starting it, right? That's fine. Of course, these buildings were not built from drawings in the normal fashion. What's that? What's that? Why is that? What? The battery has died. Okay, absolutely, you have permission. Thank you. Sorry? will come back to the white flags in the tea bushes when this slideshow has run its course. Okay. Now, if we can turn off the projection, I'll just speak a little bit more about this. How are we doing for time? 8:30? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's fine. So we've basically got 3.5 hours left. I'd like to make a few detailed comments, because of course there wasn't time to walk along with all the slides and what was going on and all that. You remember the tea bushes?
With the white flags.
With the white flags. What happened there, the size of this campus is about 9 city blocks. And after we had worked with our clients to produce a pattern language, which I won't go into any detail on because I think many of you may be familiar with at least something about that. What happened next was that to lay out the buildings, we walked that site, of course, dozens, if not hundreds of times over. We tried to place ourselves in such a way that one could visualize very simple questions. Where is the best place to enter this campus? What is the first thing that you might want to come to, and so on and so forth. And we had the flags were mostly about 6 foot high, bamboo stakes. We planted these flags and looked at them. And then we planted them some more and looked at them again. And kept on with that sort of operation until we felt comfortable walking essentially the whole imaginary time. I should tell you that there were virtually no drawings whatsoever at that time. Of course, there were odd, rough doodles. But essentially, we paid attention to the position of the buildings, the height of the buildings, the length of the buildings, the width of the buildings, and so forth. And perhaps even more important, we were creating the space between the buildings with equal care and intensity. And so gradually we collectively formed a vision of what kinds of places there were, where they were, and our chief client, who was a man by the name of Hosoi, was quite stunned. By the time we had finished, it was several months, of course, while this flagging out took place. And he said, several times, reflecting on his experience in the months that had been passing, he said, we could see the buildings standing there. There were no buildings, of course, at that point. But the situation was so real that to him, he could see exactly what was happening, what was going to happen, and so on. And at this point, we were still not dealing with drawings. Now, and then when it came to, I mean, so that the staking out of these rather complex buildings and the way in which we approached it would have been completely impossible in System B. In other words, if you set out, let's say you're an employee or an owner of a large planning firm, and you were then busily placing pencil to paper, or in these days, CAD lines to paper, or CAD lines to print out, there would have been no possibility of creating the feeling that happened within any one single building of the whole lot. It would not have been conceivable to make a drawing on a drafting table or on a CAD screen in order to determine the size and shape and position of the buildings. The reason being that you can only do that kind of work when you are doing it with your own body, your own heart, the communication of the building crews. So I mean, this is already just one example of a huge departure from the current way of thinking about architecture. Currently, architecture is a discipline that has to do with making drawings, which are then transmitted to construction companies. The idea that one could actually inject profound feeling into such a process would have been just funny, quite impossible. And yet it's the most commonsensical thing that you could possibly do. I mean, if you actually want to lay out some buildings and build them, of course that's how you have to start. Once we'd been through this fairly lengthy period of time when we were doing the flagging out, we began work on the individual buildings. And at one part of in the slideshow, you saw a whole series of very, very rudimentary paper and cardboard models of all sorts. That was how we began. Once we had the position and general dimensions, roughly the height, roughly the length and the width, which one could get all from the flagging out, one then, it's fascinating actually, because you can make a model. Several of the models that you saw on the screen, and we had hundreds of them, of course. They are, those kind of models, amazingly, you don't have to do them 100 times over. You don't have to use an eraser. You just start putting it together as a model with glue and paper and cardboard, balsa wood, and various other simple things. Sometimes one could make one of those models in a day. And they are extremely rough, but actually the buildings in many cases followed these rudimentary models to an extraordinary degree, so that the feeling that was being carried by all of us that were working on the project went all the way through into the execution of the buildings. Now we've of course were the builders of this thing, although we had some help, because we needed Japanese crews. I think the number of architecture students being trained today in the United States or in England who know how to do those things, I would put a rough guess, maybe 2% of the architectural student population know how to build a building or have actually done it. Which of course is another colossal problem, because that's just idiot work. I mean, so that the whole organization of the construction of our environment is being done in a fashion which, even from my homespun way of talking about this, you can tell that it will not succeed. Whereas what we did succeed to a very large degree. Of course, during the course of construction, there were changes being made continuously, but we were careful and prudent with the money. We had a very clear understanding of what money had to be spent on what. And so we were skilled enough to when something came along on the site and it became obvious that such and such was too long or too short, or the bays were too narrow, or whatever, all kinds of things. Where were the windows? What was the roof pitch, etc. These things were all being tested while they were being done, and we were watching very, very sharply how those things were going, and made changes as and when they were needed, and in a way that was consistent with the budget that we carried. I can go on with that in a little while, but I want to mention an interesting fact. You probably know who the Yakuza are, do you? The mafia, the Japanese mafia. The Yakuza are very deeply, well, certainly this was true in the 80s when we were doing the bulk of the work. I've lost my train. Sorry. Hold on, it'll come back to me in a second. So the Yakuza were very, very closely connected with the large construction corporations. These corporations were huge, on the whole bigger than most American building or architectural companies. It was said at that time that they could swing a motion in Parliament, in the Japanese Parliament, on almost any issue. Anyway, so they were very powerful individuals. Now, so at a certain point, Mr. Hosoi, our chief client, was called to a meeting in Shinjuku, and sat down with some of the Japanese contractors and their representatives. And Hosoi said to them, of course, "Can you tell me why I'm here? You've asked me to come, and I'm polite enough to come, but would you let me know what this is all about?" And they said, "Yes, it's quite simple. We want you to get Alexander out of Japan." And the reason was not because we were doing bad work. The reason was that our work was lower in price than the going rate in many cases. And it was a colossal potential embarrassment for the Japanese construction industry. And that as they failed in getting me lifted out of Japan. There was a lot of struggles and various things. And in fact, I haven't told you one important point, the way in which they had hoped to prevail in this desire of theirs was that they offered Hosoi $80,000 in a bag if he would kick me out of Japan. And his reply to them was, "It's not enough money." The significant point about this humorous story is that they genuinely knew that they were, of course they were doing good work in their own way, System B. They were not incompetent from an engineering point of view. Actually, that's not quite true either, but I might come to that if we have time. But they feared that the whole industry would collapse in its present form if they were not able to stop the kind of activities that we were engaging in. They knew us to be very responsible people. We carried out, well, you've seen the work that we carried out. We had to make a number of political deals in order to continue and complete the work. Well, as I've told you, it wasn't quite completed because there were 2 or 3 college buildings which were not built, and there was the library was not built. So there was that was simply because well, it's a very complicated story. I don't think I can get into that story just now. But but anyway, the big point was that everybody knew very well what was going on. They knew that somehow this would have an effect. And at this point, we have been writing a book, it's about 500 pages, describing this production system that we created and how it worked. And so they were at risk, quite very seriously at risk. But they did manage to force us to a compromise, which again is an enjoyable and funny story. And in spite of my threat about midnight, I don't think it's either good for you, nor I know it's not good for me to keep you here for too long, you know. So there are many details which you will be able to read in this forthcoming book, which Oxford University Press will be putting out shortly. It may be that this book will have the effect of altering the Japanese production system. It's by no means a certainty. It's possible that this book may have the effect of altering the path of the big construction companies in all the countries of the world. It's possible. I doubt if I'll see it in my lifetime. But I do think it will happen. I don't know why I'm so thirsty today. The real issue is life is the only criterion that is a worthy criterion for the construction of the environment. That is not what is happening today. Some of the details I've given you are necessary to make this a successful, loving, useful environment. I'm getting a bit tired. I think I better stop, and I have a page somewhere which I was going to read out to you. I hope it's opposite. I can't remember now. But let's just have a look. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to read you a short page which I just wrote this a couple of days ago just to sort of prepare for this lecture. So, as I've just said, the creation of life and of the living is and must be the fundamental criterion for our activities when we build the environment, whether they be freeway building, housing projects, tracts, etc., etc. So anyway, what I wrote here is the following. Now, can we truthfully say that the Asian campus is a living structure? And is it true to say that the structure which is living, like the, I think I missed something, that any structure which is living, like the Asian campus, is a very rare event, difficult to achieve in practice, a kind of structure not easy to replicate? The theory of replicating this structure, an achievable structure, can be made actual, practicable, and workable. We must make this available in our present-day society. Even though it is hard, it is useless for us to see it only as a target, not realizable in practice. The non-living structures which have surrounded us on Earth for about 100 years have undermined human society at gigantic cost to us, our fellow beings. The paradigm of the robot or simulation of living structure do not have the attributes of living structure and are not and cannot be living environments. This must be achieved now. Social disorder, mental illness, failure to keep pace with spiritual understanding, children, animals, plants, form a rich fabric. But this rich fabric does not yet have its own Bill of Rights. Although artificial, complex layered structure of our environment are forms of life, and useful semi-living machines are helpful in medicine. But we are not yet living as living, soulful creatures, and will not be until the necessary structures of living society and living environments are fully present. This is not only a criticism of the physical structure of buildings and towns. We have the information that is needed to reach this state. Many books written in the last 100 years have by now spelled out detailed information about living structure, how the structure must be supported, cared for, regulated, how the structure can be maintained in vibrant and living state of health. We have no excuse for neglecting our knowledge. We must act on what we know, and we must make use of the rich field of architecture with the information that is now available. I'm sorry I've tired myself out. I'm enjoying this very, very much, and I wish I could go on a bit longer, but I can't. So please forgive me.
Will you take a few questions?
Yes, I will. Yeah.
Mr. Alexander has agreed to take a few questions. So we have time for about 4 or 5 questions from the audience.
Great, wonderful talk here. I was curious if you could tell us more about how buildings can create love or unconditional love.
I can't hear very well.
Could you please repeat the question?
I'm sorry, I normally have hearing aids, but one of them has let me down, and my ears are getting worse. So,
The question is, how do buildings create unconditional love?
how do they
buildings create unconditional love?
Did I say that? Hang on a minute. I said some pretty crappy things, but I don't think I said anything quite as bananas as that. I think it's a...
Buildings create love. You mentioned that buildings...
it's just the unconditional was the word that... yeah, when a building is being properly made, and by that I mean its internal organization, its human organization. If it is, when I say properly, if it is properly made, that means that whoever the people are that are working on that building are in a position where they speak and make from love. This is not some sort of soupy romanticism. It simply means that if we love honestly our fellow beings and the places where we are, then the kind of things that you've seen on the screen will arise. It's not magic. It just has to do with the intensity and dedication to which you do your best.
Yes. I had a girlfriend once that I loved with honesty and intensity, and I did my best, and it went horribly wrong. And this was, you know, with the best of intentions and the wish for something long, passionate, lasting, and you know, going into family. So it can go wrong. Can you speak to that?
Of course it can go wrong. Do you think I'm a magician?
So basically, yes, there's bullshit crap all over the place. It happens in architecture, it happens in computer programming, it happens in art. Now, to spend the time and the energy and the passion and the dedication to get people on your side, to fight the political fights, to lead a type of spirit, but to manifest the leadership to get people to work with you, that takes so much that to
Mark, you got it.
yeah, I got to come to it. Exactly. I hear what you're saying. It's hard. We're trying.
No, that's not. You can say that you're trying, but whether you're actually trying is, to some degree, an objective question, an empirical question, and trying takes certain forms. I mean, you can kid yourself that you're trying, and I mean, so it just depends how far you're willing to go. My impression is that people who have experienced this way of making things will not give it up.
Good evening. Thank you for, first of all, for giving a lecture, which is not, as we all know, trying to be politically correct, but really trying to lay out your thoughts.
I couldn't understand what she said.
Thank you for giving a lecture.
No, I got that, but I didn't get the last sentence.
Thank you for laying out your thoughts while not being politically correct.
Oh, I see. Okay. Good. Yep. That's.
I have a, whether I agree or not, that's something else, but that's for another discussion. But I have a brief question. You alluded again and again through your discussion about the fact that we have lost in the last 200 years an ability to make buildings into good built environments. Not buildings, but good built environments. Where do you see the next 200 years? What are the more specific traits that built environments should have to really be able to be about life?
Attention to detail. I mean, if you want to make a room that is, let's say, a living room in a house, do you know enough and can you concentrate enough to make that room work in a way that really acts as a, whatever you want to call it, a kind of nest or something. And this is a real task. It's not nonsense. It is not being taught, generally speaking, by architecture professors. It is, nevertheless, a perfectly feasible and practicable venture. And I think the idea that you can't do these things because it is too difficult is really because System B has corroded society to such a point that people maybe are doubtful or queasy about bucking it. Or they just don't even know what System A is. So, I mean, I agree with the misgivings that you're expressing. I agree with them as being reasonable misgivings that a reasonable person might have. But they can be surmounted. I mean, there's not, I don't think there's any issue like that cannot be surmounted by patience and hard work and clarity of thought. But the clarity of thought has to be about the human heart. It's not the clarity of thought about anything. I think Ken gave us was it 4 or 5 questions? I think we've had 3, have we, or was it 4?
2 more.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you give any specific examples of how the campus in Japan was built with, I guess, love or the way System A as opposed to something
Well, as you could see, the materials that we used were fairly ordinary. They were put together in somewhat unusual ways. But there was no sort of magic mushroom there. The issue is, let's say you're approaching a building that is just you've got it started. And now we come to your question. What happened to the glass of water that I had? Oh, there it is. Thank you very much. Now, there are techniques which by now have been fairly widely discussed and practiced. Where you learn that each feature of let's just talk about a living room because it's relatively simple and it makes a useful example. So now you say to yourself, and whoever else is involved in the future living in this place and in the activity of the construction activity, you ask yourself at every moment whether the particular decision that you are just contemplating, I mean, it might be, where should the fireplace be, if it's a house that indeed has a fireplace? Where should it be? Too bad I can't show it to you, but I, in one of my books, show examples of the mock-ups of a fireplace in a certain house that we were building. The mock-ups are very simple. They're just made of corrugated cardboard, the odd stick here and there, and some paint and stuff like that. But you are looking at the volume of the actual fireplace. It's the opening, the hearth, the shelf if there is one, and so forth. And each time you attempt a decision, well, inevitably, as one goes through any act of making, you're comparing possibilities. So we've got this fireplace. You say, okay, is this, let's say we're looking at a particular thing. I mean, you've just knocked it together, corrugated cardboard, tape, and so again, it's a mock-up that you could have made in an hour. And then perhaps you make variants on it. Now you can ask yourself various questions about these alternate possibilities. You can ask which of the two, let's say we've got two which have slightly different proportions perhaps or something. Which of the two has more life? Now, that's in itself not a particularly easy question to answer, but nevertheless, it's an answerable question. And in some cases, for people who have religious inclinations, you might frame the question as, if I'm making this fireplace as a gift for God, then which of the two would make a better and more fitting gift? Now, of course, God is, I'm going to leave out the metaphysical issues about God, and I'm simply going to say that, among other things, when one speaks about God, it is it's something that is known to you or that is felt by you. Of course, there are some people who simply say, I can't be bothered with such nonsensical hooey. And fair enough, then that obviously is not going to work. But there are other questions, like the first one the other tests, which reach the same result. So all of these things are empirical if you actually take the trouble to find out how does one have more deep feeling than the other. If I want to improve it from the point of view of its deep feeling, what would I have to do? You have to be extremely honest, because the first thing that usually happens when you're doing that kind of thing is that somehow you're relying on stereotypes, and then you're attempting to compare different stereotypes. But of course that will not get you to answer those questions. But nevertheless, you can answer them. And really what I've just said is pretty homespun, but it works. Number 5. Who is going to be the lucky or unlucky?
So nature uses a lot of modularity in the living structure that it has created. If you look at our bodies, there are lots of cells in there. And for many of these cells...
They're all different, aren't they? Every pair of cells are different in the body.
That's my point. So the cells have the same structural plan. However, each individual cell is somewhat different, and they get their difference from the environment in which they develop as we grow up and age.
Mm-hmm.
So now carrying this over to the domain of architecture, might there be a happy compromise where the role of the architect is to create a flexible shell, and there may be a fairly general set of templates, and then let it be up to the occupants to now refine that shell and make them exactly, perfectly identical.
Right, that's an old and weather-worn idea.
And as they change their attitude.
And it doesn't work. And let me tell you why. Here's why it doesn't work. In an organism, there are holes, of course, at many different levels, including the organism in its entirety, or including even the surroundings. And there are holes within those holes, and then there are smaller holes, and so on and so on and so on. It is not possible to attempt to build a structure by just arranging these things. They butt up against their context. They butt up against the container that you were describing. If the container cannot give way flexibly, you'll be looking at a monkey's ass. I mean, really, in other words, it's a nice idea, and there were several decades where people thought this was a really good idea. It's not a good idea, because you need, for instance, the position of the doors and of the windows and the nature of the floor, and etc., etc., etc. All of these things, there is give and take between the larger whole and those details that you want to fill it up with. If you say, well, let's have the container be a rigid, factory-made entity of the size of a house, for example. And then you start running into, okay, well now, how are we going to place the front door given this lunatic shell that we've been given? Because that isn't where the front door wants to be. I mean, of course, I'm just making something up too rapidly. But in effect, the small holes and the larger holes have to be able to be in a give and take relationship. And anything that constrains a building in the way in which you've just described really does not work. I mean, of course you can make it work, but it does not become beautiful. It does not become life-giving. It is a rather foolish way to do it. I think I've got to question number 6, which lets me out the door. Thank you very much.